Hey guys, how's it going? It's Jay, and in this video, I'm going to be covering the Nikon Z30. Now, this is a content creating camera, and in this video, I'm going to show you how to use this camera from start to finish. I'm going to go over everything from a beginner-oriented perspective. So it's going to be a long video. It's very detailed, super thorough. I'm going to go over all the camera modes, the camera body, like the menu system. I'm not going to go over the entire menu system because it is so ridiculously deep and vast. There's so many options in there, but I'm going to give you a really good breakdown on how to use the camera in photo and video in all the various different modes that you're most likely going to use. So because this video is going to be so long, guys, below the video I have set up navigation links to like key topics like different camera modes and stuff like that, autofocus settings. And lastly, I just wanted to thank real quick BH Photo for letting me borrow the Nikon Z30. So thank you BH Photo for letting me borrow this and allow me to make this content for you guys. So be sure to check out BH Photo. Those links are below in the description area as well. All right, let's get right into it. Alrighty, let's get hands-on with the Nikon Z30. Looking at it from the top, let's just start there. These two things here are for the neck strap. So you can weave it through here and that will support the camera. You can use a wrist strap or whatever. Also looking along the top here, we have the stereo microphones right here, and the microphones are very high quality on this camera, I gotta say. Sounds really good using the on-camera mics. I was quite impressed. All right, so it looks like it's a little bit overcast today. Now, obviously the gimbal is gonna make this footage look a little bit smoother. I have the ISO set to auto, again, because I'm in full auto mode, so the camera's doing all the thinking for me. Now you have a speaker right here, which you'll hear if you're playing your videos back, for example. Now, right above the speaker, there's a little symbol there. That symbol stands for the sensor plane. So if you're using manual focus lenses or macro photography and things like that, you might have to measure from the actual sensor to calculate your focus and stuff like that. And that's what that is. Now here you have what's called the mode dial. So these are the different camera modes. I'm just going to put it in full auto mode for now. And I'm going to show you what full auto mode does first when I turn the camera on, and then I will go through the different camera modes as well. Now, looking at the top, we have the on-off button here, and we have the shutter button. Now, the shutter button is this button here, and it's a two-stage button. So if you press it lightly, it has like a stop in it, and that will focus the camera. And then if you press it all the way, there's a secondary like stop, and that will actually take the photo by default. That's how that works. Again, this is the on-off toggle. So you can turn the camera on and off with that lever there. Now also you have an ISO button here, or an ISO button. That's the camera gain or the camera sensor sensitivity. Then you have an exposure compensation button, and that will basically control the brightness and darkness if you want to manipulate the image one way or another. So you can overexpose or underexpose by using that button. And I'll show you how all this stuff works live once I turn the camera on and everything, but I just want to go over everything in detail first. Now here you have the record button for recording video. And this is what's called a command dial. Now you have a command dial here for your thumb, and then you have another command dial on the front here. Now this one on the back is considered the primary command dial, and this is considered the secondary command dial. Now you also have function buttons in here. You have a function 1 and a function 2. These can be custom configured to a lot of different things, but by default, one of them is set up for white balance and the other one is set up for autofocus area. Now, still looking at the top, you have here what's called a hot shoe, and that's where you would put a microphone. You can slide a microphone in there if you wanted to, or of course a flash unit and other accessories that Nikon makes will slide in there, and you can utilize those. Now also on the front here, I just wanted to show you, we have here is the lens release. I'll show you this again when I mount a lens in a minute, and underneath this cap is the sensor. So if I unscrew this cap, that's the sensor right there. The sensor you don't want to expose, you don't want dust to get in there, you don't want to damage it. Also on the front here you have a tally light. So when you hit the record button, this light will light up to let you know that it's actually recording, which is a cool feature, and you can actually control the brightness of that inside the menu, which is pretty sweet. All right, so looking at it from the back, we have a bunch more buttons here. So right here you have an autofocus and an auto exposure lock. So if you hold this button down, it'll lock that for you. And also you can, if you're in playback mode and you press this button, it'll put a protection tag on your photo or video so you don't accidentally delete it. Now here, this is a very important toggle. You have video and photo. So the camera is going to behave differently depending on what mode you have it in. And it's just important that you know what mode you're in here. So make sure if you're recording videos, you have it on video. If you're taking photos, put it in photo mode. Now you have a display button here that will change the way the screen looks as far as how much data, is around the border. Again, I'll show you that when the camera's on. You have a garbage can to throw stuff out. If you're in playback menu, you can delete photos and videos using the garbage can. Up here, what you have, release modes. It's basically if you want to take multiple shots in a row, like rapid fire mode, or if you want to use self timer, that's why there's the little self timer icon there. Also on the back, we have an I button here. Now the I button is very similar to the function menu on Sony cameras or the Q menu on Canon cameras. And basically it's just a shortcut to the most used features. It'll pop up on the bottom of the screen. I'll show you that in a minute. And you can actually custom configure that as well for the settings that you like to use most. And of course we have the playback menu, and of course you have the menu button. Now you have a directional pad here that goes in a bunch of different directions, and then the OK button in the center as well. So that's going to be your confirmation button type thing. Now looking at the side of the camera here, you have these rubber doors, which are a little bit hard to get back on. The doors work well. I mean, they're weather sealed and stuff, and they have a nice protection. You can see how there's like a notch here, so water is not going to be able to get through that rubber and then over the notch in order to get into the port. So that design is very good as far as weather sealing goes, but they're kind of hard to get back on, to be honest. But anyways, up here you have the micro HDMI, and down here you have a USB-C charging port and also data transfer port. That's what that is. And then you can just swivel this back and kind of like push it in like so. Kind of got to just push it all over to get it all the way in. And then up here you have the microphone port. Now there is no headphone port on this camera, but it does have the mic, which is very convenient for using, an external microphone, like a mic like this, for example. You would just plug this right into that mic port, and then you can slide the microphone itself into the hot shoe, and then you'll have a nice, higher quality microphone going directly into the camera. So you won't have to worry about syncing that audio up in post. If you're using like a standalone microphone, you might have to sync the audio. It's very convenient to be able to just plug it right into the camera and get that higher quality audio just recorded right in with your video. So it's less work in post, you know what I mean? So again, looking at the back, we have this LCD screen, which is very nice, like 1,000,000 pixels. And if you grab it right here, it'll swivel out. And now you can see it's kind of in selfie mode. So if you're in front of the camera, you'll be able to see the screen. But the screen also rotates. So you can rotate the screen all the way around. So now it's facing the back of the camera. So you can use it like this, or you can use it like that, aim it up, get the camera very low. You can aim it like this, and now you can have the camera like over your head, and you'd be able to see the screen from the bottom, which is cool. And another thing I really like is that if a microphone is plugged in, see how the screen kind of doesn't hit the microphone port? So you can kind of swivel the door past even if you have a microphone plugged in, which I really like. In addition to that, you can close the screen this way and get like an armor mode. So this is a nice protective mode, which I highly recommend using if you're stowing the camera in your bag. That protects the screen, just in case something bounces in your bag. You don't want that screen to get scratched. So on the bottom here, you have a 1/4" thread where you can put a tripod plate, something like this. You can just screw right in there, and then you can put this, you can mount this right to your tripod if that's the kind of style tripod you have. Or you can just screw it right to a mini tripod like this with the 1/4 thread. And that's what that's for. Now also here you have a battery door and memory card door. It's got a lock lever here, so you can just slide that over and then the door will release. Now the door also has a little notch right here. You'll see this little notch. That's a rubber notch. You can bend that notch out of the way for dummy batteries. So they make these battery blanks that go in, and it has a cord that comes out, and that's what that little notch is for. It's for that cord, so it can come through and so you can still close the door. This little yellow lever here, if you slide that back, the battery will pop out. There's a spring underneath it. And here's what the battery looks like. Now, you're definitely going to want to get a couple extra batteries because the battery life on this camera is not that good. It estimates about 330 photos. So you're going to want to get a few spare batteries, at least get one. And I got links below the video for you if you want to pick up an extra battery. So that goes in this way, like this. So it goes, and you just slide it in, and then it locks in. You can see how that locked to hold the battery. Now the memory card, you just got to push down and it'll pop up, and you can take that out. And this is the memory card I am using for this camera. This is a UHS 1 memory card slot, so you don't necessarily need a UHS 2 memory card like I have here, but it will still work better when you put the memory card into your computer and you're trying to get the video files and photos off of it. The faster card will still speed that process up. So even though the camera might not be able to take advantage of it, you can still take advantage of it once you're trying to get the video footage off the camera. So, and when you put the card in, the label of the card actually goes towards the battery. So it goes like this, and you just push it down like so. And then the door, it auto locks. So that is a basic overview of the camera body. And again, in your hand, this thing feels great. You can see the grip here, how it has this really nice notch, and you get a really nice firm grasp of the camera, and it supports, like, it won't slip because of that notch. I really like the way that feels. And then it has this nice little dent for the, like this bump out for your thumb. So you can hold the camera and you're not hitting any buttons by mistake, and you have a really nice firm grip. So big fan of the build quality and design of the Nikon Z30. Now it doesn't have a viewfinder because it's optimized for video, but you can still use this camera for photos and it does a fantastic job. One other thing I wanted to show you though is when you're charging the camera, you do need to charge this beast up before you use it because the battery does not come charged. So I have a charger cord here. They do give you a cable and a wall outlet charger, but you do have to have the battery in the camera when you charge it. So I'm just going to plug this USB-C in here, and I have it going to a power brick. And when you plug it in, you'll see the orange light light up right there. See that orange light? And when the battery's fully charged, that light should go out and you'll be ready to go at that point. I got the Z30 with both of these lenses. So this worked out to about $1,100 for the kit with both of these lenses. So I have the 16-50, which is perfect for, you know, vlogging, landscapes and stuff like that with that wide angle 16mm, and the 50mm telephoto end is pretty good for, you know, portraits, things like that. And then this lens picks up right where this one leaves off. So it starts at 50 and it goes all the way to 250, which is an unbelievable telephoto range. So again, I'm happy with both of these lenses, and I'm going to show you a bunch of sample photos during this video. And I think you'll agree that these kit lenses are really high quality optically as far as sharpness and things like that go, especially when you factor in the cost. You know, you always have to factor in the cost of the lenses. Another thing I wanted to note is these lenses have like a stow position. So this lens doesn't work until you open it like that. So now the lens is open. It starts at 50mm and goes all the way to 250. And it is kind of hard to zoom this lens. It's not that smooth. But I just wanted to illustrate how they have this open state. So when the lens is like this, it won't work. It's actually closed, and the camera will tell you it's closed, and it'll tell you that you have to open it. So I'm just going to mount up this lens though, so you can see how to do that. So first thing you got to do is take off the lens cap, which is really easy. You just got to rotate it and pull it off. And again, you do want to be careful not to get that sensor dirty or damaged or anything like that. So just be cognizant of that sensor. It's, you know, fragile. You want to be very careful with that thing. All right, so now notice there's a white dot on the lens here, and there's a white dot on the lens mount right there. You need to line those up like that, and then twist the lens, and you'll hear it lock. Hear that click? That click is this pin here. This is the release pin right here. I'm pressing it, and now I can untwist the lens, and you'll actually see the pin right here. See that pin going in and out? That's the lock pin. So that's what holds the lens on, and it makes it so you can't twist it off, you know? So I can't get the lens off right now. It's like on there permanent. Not permanent, but it's like fixed, you know, really well. So now this is the focus ring for the lens if you want to use manual focus, and this is the zoom ring. But again, just like that other lens, you have to open this lens first. So this is the compact, you know, stowaway position, which is great because it makes the camera smaller. You can get it in a smaller bag for travel and whatnot. But to use the lens or camera, you have to open it. So right here is 16mm, and now the lens will work. You're gonna have to take off the lens cap as well, and that's what the front of the lens looks like. So now you can zoom the lens. So here's 50, you know, and so forth. and it's a variable aperture zoom lens, which means at 16 millimeter, the aperture is at f3.5, and at 50 millimeter, the aperture is at 6.3. So that's the max aperture for that given focal length. I'll get more into that when we get into aperture priority mode a little later. All right, guys, let me just flip the screen around here, like so, and I'm just going to turn this beast on. All right, so I have the camera in full auto, as I showed you before, and I have the camera set to video mode on the little toggle there. So if you're looking at it, this is what it looks like by default. Now, if you hit the display button here, you can see how the display changes. You see, now I have a histogram view there, and if I hit it again, now we have the auto leveler. That's what that view is, and that'll help you level the camera for, you know, make sure your horizons are level and stuff like that. And then this view just kind of shows you like all the camera settings, and it works really well. And if you want to start recording, you just hit this record button right here on the top of the camera, and it'll start recording. And you can see here on the back, it says it's recording. You see the little record icon right there. And then on the front, you can see the tally light is lit to let you know that it's recording. So that's how that works. I'm just going to hit the record button so it stops. If you hit the I button here, will give you quick access to some of the camera features. Now, because I'm in full auto mode, a lot of these features are grayed out and you can't change them. So you'll have to be in a different camera mode in order to get more power out of the camera. But there are still a lot of features you can use. You can see here, set picture control, can't use that one. Frame size and frame rate, now that's your video quality. So that it's allowing you to change. So if I go in there, I can change that. Now I want the video quality set to high. And I also want to use 4K. So if I go over here, all right, so the 2160 option is the 4K option, and you can scroll through. You have 24 frames per second, 25 frames per second for those PAL users in European countries and stuff, and then you have 30 frames per second if you prefer that format. Now it also has 1080 24p. Fast car. I'm so sorry. Tracy Chapman, right? .1080 24p 120, which will give you 5 times slow motion. That's what that option is right there. So if you want to record slow motion footage, you're going to want to choose that option. So I'm just going to put it to 4K 24p because that's what I like to use. And I usually would recommend having the camera set for that. If you're just recording content of you talking in front of the camera, things like that, I would recommend that quality. So now over here to the right, I want to show you the AF area mode. Now this is very important because This is where you can set the camera up to track humans and animals and stuff. And if you look at the auto area AF, right now it's set for people, auto area people. And this will also allow you to track. So when you're in auto area, you can actually track your subject. When you're in this area, wide area, you can't track your subject. You can focus on an area and stuff, that's fine, but it won't automatically track the subject. So if you do want tracking, you have to use these 3 bottom ones, which are called auto area modes. So then, of course, you have single point AF. So if you want to dial in your focus to just one single spot, you would select this option, and then you could move the focus point around and have like the most precise autofocus, you know, for a given area, which is very helpful depending on what you're trying to do. But I just wanted to show you that I would recommend having it here if you're recording in front of the camera. You want to have it set for people, and it'll automatically focus on your eye and do a phenomenal job. Now, if you don't want it to focus on your eye, like if you want to hold up a product or something in front of the camera and your face is still in the scene, you're going to have to change it to this area mode here where there's not people. And then the camera won't prioritize the face, and it'll focus on whatever's closest to the camera. But if you have it set to people, it'll override that, and it will default to focusing on the face as the highest priority. Even if you hold something up in front of the camera, it'll kind of ignore it because there's a face in the scene. So you do need to know that you need to change that to this if you want to focus on a product or something that you're holding up, if there's human faces in the scene. Now, of course, that goes the same for animals here. You have animals. Now, if you don't want it to focus on the animal, you would want to turn it to this mode, and then it would prioritize whatever's closest to the camera, for example. So that's autofocus area, and that's what is in this eye menu, basically, when you're in full auto mode. Now, you have a couple of other options here. You have focus mode. Now, I recommend leaving it in full-time AF when you're recording video, but if you need to use manual focus, you have the MF option right there, and you also have autofocus continuous, and you have autofocus single, but I do recommend for video leaving it on full-time AF, just so you're aware. Now, notice here you can go back or you can hit OK to, you know, navigate the menu. I just wanted to point that out as well. And I'm using this pad here to navigate, but you can also touch. Just hit OK. It's pretty cool. Touchscreen's nice. So let me just play with the touchscreen for a bit. Now notice that option there that says on and it looks like a hand. If you click that, that'll show you the stabilization options. So you have sport mode, on mode, and off. Now, if you're just want stabilization on static subjects, Nikon recommends you just use on. If you are tracking moving subjects,
hey man, that was good. That was good.
So, like, I do not feel in tune with my bike at all.
Just about to
and you want stabilization on, Nikon recommends you have it on sport mode. So keep that in mind if you're tracking moving subjects. You might want to switch it to sport. I've been leaving it on for the most part though, just normal. Click OK. And then you have microphone option here. Now this is very convenient because, especially if you're using an external microphone, you can see here how the audio meters are there. And just me talking, kind of maxing it out. I'm near the top of it. So by hitting the left and the right arrow, you could see I just turned the audio off. And now I can dial in the audio. You see that? So you kind of want it like right about there. Like if you look at the meter, you don't really want it to max out. You want it like just a couple of dashes before maxing out. In my opinion, that's where I would recommend setting it. But if you're in full auto mode, you could just leave this on auto and the camera really does do a good job. And like I said, when I did that vlogging test with this camera, the audio was really good straight off the camera, so without using an external mic. I was very impressed with that. Now if we go back in here, the rest of the options for the most part are grayed out except for wind noise reduction. You might want to use wind noise reduction. I usually have that off because if it's windy, I'm going to use an external mic that has a windsock on it like this. You know, this will stop the wind. The wind noise reduction is, it screws up the audio a little bit and it makes like the dialogue sound weird. It actually makes your voice sound different when you have that on, so I don't like using it. And then here you have Wi-Fi connection. You can turn that on here if you want to connect the camera to your smart device and things like that. And electronic vibration reduction. You can have this on, but when you turn this on, the sensor, it kind of crops in a little bit, but it will give you more stabilization. It's just an electronic stabilization on top of the optical stabilization that the lens has. So if you're just holding it on a tripod like this, like a handheld unit, then you might want to enable the electronic stabilization as well, because it will help cancel out some of that shake like you see, you know? So it's a nice feature, and it's all right there in the eye menu, which is very convenient. And like I said earlier, you can custom configure this eye menu to your needs. Now, watch what happens when I switch the camera mode to program auto mode. And now if I go into the eye menu, notice how nothing's grayed out. Now I have the option to change the white balance over here on the left. You can see we have picture control, but right here is the white balance. So now you can change the white balance. Now that's basically it's how the camera decides what shade of color to put on your images based off what it thinks white is. So, you know, if you want your skin tones to be accurate and stuff like that, you really want to have your white balance set to the environment that you're in. Now, auto does a really good job, so you can just leave it there, of course, but I would recommend hard setting it when you can. So this way the white balance doesn't fluctuate if like the clouds move or something. You don't want your skin tones going like, you know, towards green or towards magenta. So if you have it hard set, it'll help with that. So I always recommend hard setting it when you can. But when in doubt, you can just put it on auto, and the camera does a really good job. Now up here you have picture control. And if you go in there, these are all the different picture control options. And this camera has a lot of options here. It's got standard, neutral, vivid, monochrome, portrait, landscape, flat. Now it has some more creative modes. So it has a dream mode, morning mode, pop, Sunday, somber, dramatic, silence, bleached, I don't even know how to say that, pure, denim, toy, sepia, blue, red, pink, charcoal, graphite, binary, and carbon. So these are all the different, you know, picture effects or whatever you want to call it. And it's pretty cool that that has that built in, and that works for video. So you can record video in any of these different effects if you want to get like a cool look to your content that you're creating. And that's where that is. And they by default put it right in to the eye menu so you can get there quickly. But you do have to be in program auto or the other creative modes such as manual mode, aperture mode, shutter priority mode in order to have access to that feature. Now you also have access to the metering modes when you put it in program auto. And metering modes will allow you to prioritize where the metering comes from. And what the metering is how the camera determines what a proper exposure is. So the camera tries to calculate like the bright stuff and the dark stuff in a scene, and that's what metering is. So you can kind of narrow down where the metering is coming from. So that's why this one says center weight metering. So the camera's only going to use the center area to try to figure out the proper exposure, as opposed to using the matrix metering, which uses the entire sensor or the entire screen to figure out the metering. And then you have highlight weighted metering. So that's a very cool feature, and it'll basically protect your highlights. So it'll make sure that the highlights don't blow out. Now, this is very helpful for things like a bright wedding dress or that bright frothy white water, you know, when you're recording flowing water, for example. So that's what metering modes are for, and you can get to them in the info menu here, or the eye menu. Now you have active dynamic range lighting. I have that turned off, but that will help with shadows and stuff. It'll just fill in the shadows a little bit if you turn on the dynamic lighting options. And then, of course, you have these other features we already talked about, but you just get a little bit more when you're in program auto as opposed to full auto. So now let's just go into the menu here. So notice on the left here how you have your main categories, and then in here are all the like sub options. So if you go over to the left, you can go up and down, or you can just touch. So you can touch in here as well. So you can just go over here and touch around. Very convenient. You can scroll. If you get to a menu where there's more, you can scroll like this. Very, very nice how this menu system and camera is just set up that way. I really like how you can use the touch, or you can use the pad if you want, you know, whichever way you prefer to navigate. with this camera. It's very nice. Now, playback menu here. That's where those options are. Now here are going to be your photo specific options. So you do have quite a few options for photo and video that are like redundant almost. For example, if I go up here to the top, notice how you have image size, image quality, and ISO settings, for example. Now watch when I go to video mode. See how I have ISO sensitivity settings in here as well? I also have white balance. I also have video type, frame size. And so you have those options in both video and photo. So you can independently change that stuff for your needs. Like, it's really nice having it separate like that, in my opinion. That's why I'm spending the time to go over it, because it's just nice having that power. Now, as far as image quality goes, I would definitely go in here and change that. I would put that on JPEG fine if you're a JPEG shooter, but if you want the best quality possible, I would recommend shooting raw quality. That's what I tend to shoot most. And you will have to edit your photos after the fact, though, in like a program like Lightroom. Or you can do raw plus JPEG fine, of course, if you want both files, which is a good way to go if you don't want to edit your photos, but you might want to in the future or something like that. Now, a couple other things I wanted to show you here in the menu is down here is where all your custom settings are. So this is where the more like advanced features are. And if you go in here and go to autofocus, for example, look at all these features. This is a very powerful camera. This camera is more powerful than I thought it was going to be. When I went in here, I was like, whoa. So this is where you can set your priorities and your focus tracking with lock on. You know, if I just scroll down here, you have maximum shots for burst photo. There's just so many options here. Shutter type. Now bracketing, if you go in here, this is where your bracketing options are. If you want to shoot HDR and things like that, you can manipulate your bracketing order. Now this is where you can change your command dials, so you can control what the command dials do. Now you have this is where you can customize your eye menu. If you go in here, you can set these options as you see fit. And this is independent for both photo and video. I'm just going to go back. Now AF speed, this is your autofocus speed. You can go in here and you can make it slower or faster, and you have up to 10 options there. I mean, -5 to +5, so I guess it's 11. And that's a lot of options. So you can control your autofocus speed, and that will help with transitions. If you're going from one subject to another, how fast is the camera going to focus? Very, very powerful feature. The Sony cameras have it as well as the Canon cameras. And then tracking sensitivity, this will control how quickly the focus will go from one subject to another. So for example, if a face comes into the scene, how fast will the camera switch to that face if it's focused on something else? That's what this does. Now you're going to want to, if you don't want the focus to switch, you're going to want to have that sensitivity set to low. If you want the focus to switch immediately, you're going to want to have that set to high. It just depends on what you're doing. It's going to hit menu to go back. So now if you go down here, you have the setup menu. So now this is where you can go to format the memory card. This is where you can save user settings. So if you want to have the camera set up for, like, let's say sports photography or landscape photography, you got all your settings set, you got everything dialed in, focus area, focus mode, like all that stuff is set, and you want to save that. This is where you would go to do that. So you can click here and you can save it to U1. And if you look at the top of the camera, that's U1. So you can basically set up U1 for like sports, U2 for like landscapes, U3 for portraits or something like that. And you can have the camera completely set up totally different and just turn the dial and boom, the camera is just set up for you, ready to go. And it's a great turnkey solution for the most popular camera settings that you prefer to use. That's what that feature is for. Then of course you have language here if you need to set that. Now time zone and date, this is where you got to go to set up the date and time. And if you just go into date and time right here, you can set that up. It's very easy to do. You just scroll over, go up and down, click OK when you're done, and so forth. You want to make sure you have that set up. So this way you have an accurate recording of your images and stuff like that when you're archiving and whatnot. Now you have monitor brightness. This is a very important feature because you have no viewfinder on this camera. And when you're outside in the sun, it can be hard to see the screen. Even though this is a very high quality screen, the brightness of the screen matters. So when you're outside, you can jack up the brightness to like +5 like that, and it'll be much easier to see the screen with it set like that. And in contrast, if you're like in a, you know, a dark environment and the screen's too bright, you can lower that way down and it'll be easier on your eyes. You know how it is when you're looking at a bright screen when it's dark, it's like too bright. So you can lower it as well. And that's where you would go to do that. And it's actually in the little like wrench area. So this is a feature that you might want to add to your eye menu for video, for example. Like if you're outside and you need to change the monitor brightness often, you can add that to your eye menu and then get to it easier just by hitting the eye button, you know, or you can just go into the gear, you know. So let me just go over here. And here we have a retouch menu. Now, this is where you can go and you can actually process your RAW files and turn them into JPEGs. You can trim, you can resize your images, so you can do cropping, you can add dynamic lighting to your images, all sorts of features like that. You can straighten them, you can fix distortion, you can fix perspective, you can turn color images into monochrome, you can overlay pictures, so you can actually do like photo combining type stuff. And then, of course, you can trim video as well. So quite powerful editing features built into this camera, which I was surprised to see as well. And then down here, you have the My Menu area. This is a great feature. Most of the new cameras coming out these days have that. And if you go in here, you can just add items. So for example, I'm going to go into Setup menu and I'm going to do Format Memory Card. Format Memory Card. That looks good. Saved. All right, so now if I go up here, right, I'm just scrolling through the menu. Now if I go into my menu, you see how on the top option here, I have Format Memory Card. So it's just right there. So now I don't have to dive into the menus to find that. So remember when we were up here and we were looking at all these different custom settings? This menu is really, really deep. Like just autofocus alone, you see all these options? This is where that My Menu option comes into play. Right? Because some of those features are a little hard to find. You might not remember where they are. And if you're in the field and you're in a rush, you don't want to have to be going through all those menus to find these advanced features. You can just put it into the My Menu area and you can have multiple tabs of options. So just a nice, powerful feature. And that's pretty much how this menu system is designed. And then you have the question mark down here, which will give you more information on whatever setting you're currently in. All right, so that's just a basic overview of the menu system. So what I want to show you now, though, is how to actually use the camera. All right, so here we are behind the camera, and I have it set up with the little like human figure there. And by default, I have the camera in full auto mode. As you can see here, I have it on the green full auto. And notice I'm in photography mode. So I'm not in video mode, I'm in photography mode. And you remember how I told you when you press the shutter button down, it'll focus? You see the little dot there on the eye? And notice how it has a little arrow next to the dot, so I can switch eyes. So I can go from one eye to the other. And then if I just press the button all the way, it takes the photo, as you can see there. And then if you go into the playback menu by hitting the playback button, you can look at your photo. And you can use the plus and the minus to zoom in, you know, or you can pinch with your fingers, you know, and move around like so. Pretty awesome. So now let me go into the eye menu here. I just want to show you what it looks like in the eye menu. And you have, these are the options that you have in full auto mode. Now notice I have my quality set to raw quality. I showed you that earlier. I prefer shooting in raw quality, but JPEG is great if you're just going to share on social media and you don't want to edit after the fact. You know, if you don't want to do any editing in Lightroom, you just want to share your photos right away. Now, what I wanted to show you though is this option here, the release mode option. I mentioned it earlier because there's a button for it right here, but you can also get to it in the menu, and this is where it is. Now, this is where you would go to take rapid fire photos, and they call it continuous shooting here. So if you're taking sports photography or whatever, and you want to record, you know, you want to take photos of somebody like swinging a bat or your kid running, you know, in sports, soccer, whatever, you'd put it in this high mode like so. And now watch, when you hold the shutter down, it's going to focus. And when you press the shutter, it's rapid firing. You see that? So it's firing at its fastest frames per second that it can fire, given the lighting conditions. The maximum is like 11 frames per second that this camera can do. But you do have to have a fast enough shutter speed for that to happen. So it just depends on how bright it is outside and things like that. So that's what the release mode does right here. And that's, you can also go in there and set the self timer. Now this is great for portraits. So notice how you can do that for a number of shots. You have these options here. If you go back up, you can select 2 seconds. I usually use a 2-second self timer unless I have to go around the camera for like a family portrait type thing. Then I would set it to like 10 seconds or so. And it's cool that you can set the number of shots because you know how somebody's eyes are always closed when you're taking a picture of like multiple people. So you can set it so it takes like 3 shots and be like, all right, everybody smile, you know, and then bang, 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 it'll take. Watch, I'll show you. Let's set it for 2 seconds and watch this. See that? So it took the 3 shots, it waited 2 seconds, and good to go. So that's how that works. Now, let me go in here and I will turn that off. And notice on the bottom how there's like that little down arrow. It's kind of hard to see, but that's how you know there's more options. So if I scroll over here to low, notice how low has a little arrow as well. So if you go down to low, you can change how many frames per second you have. You can do 1 frame per second, 2, 3, and 4. So it's pretty cool how you can dial in the low option. And notice again on the bottom how the little eye symbol is telling you that that'll bring you back. So you can just hit the I button here, or you can hit the I button there because it's a touch screen, remember? Pretty cool. So I'm just going to turn that self timer off though and put it back to single frame. Now single frame means when you focus, it'll just focus and take the 1 photo like so. Now, I just want to show you something here in the menu. If I go into the menu, and I go into playback options right here. So it's the play and then playback options. If you go in there, notice how I have focus point selected and I also have exposure info. Now to check these boxes, if you look down here, there's a little thing telling you that you need to hit the right arrow button. So if I hit the right arrow on the pad here, it's turning that on and off. Now, of course, you could hit it with your finger as well. All right, so let's add that. We'll add shooting data and then we'll hit OK. Now if we go back into the playback area, when we hit the display button, and there's the other option. So now we have the RGB display showing, which is very helpful. So depending on how you want your playback menu to look, you can go into your playback options and control that. All right, so let's go over some of the focus modes here. Now if I hit the I menu, notice here on the right, that's your focus area. So let's check that out and let me show you the difference. So if you want to track your subjects, you're going to need to set it to Auto Area AF for tracking. Now you don't have to have it on people, but in my case, I'm using like a human figure there. So I'm going to set it right where it is now. Now this is the default settings. So if you want to track, you have to hit the OK button. So if I hit the OK button here, it brings up the tracking box. So now what you need to do is move it to where you want it. Something like, let's put it right there, let's say. And then if you hit the OK button again, it turns yellow. And now it's tracking the subject. Watch this. If I move this, see how the focus box is tracking? So that's how you use tracking. And it works really good. And then to exit, you just hit the minus button there on the magnifying glass. If you hit minus, it'll cancel the tracking and it'll go back to using the whole screen. And it's going to default to a face if it sees it. So that's how tracking works. Now, if you go into the I menu again, you can change that and you can turn it so there's no face. So now it's not going to look for the eye. And watch when I focus. It's just going to focus with these squares on whatever's closest to the camera and whatever it thinks it wants to focus on. Now, if I go back into the I menu and change it to this wide area, now you have a wide area focus with people. So if I select that option, now you have this box. See the box? So it's not going to see any people because there's no face. But if you use the directional pad, you could move it up to put it over the face. And now, see how the eye is there? So it's using the IAF autofocus within that little box. So that's what that option is for. So it's just limiting your focus area to a smaller area, basically. And that's how that works for photography. Now, if we go back in here and we go up to photo shooting menu, I just want to show you a couple other options as it pertains to photography. So a lot of this stuff is grayed out though, because we're in full auto mode. But if you go down here, I just wanted to show you, you do have access to interval timer shooting. So if you go in there, you can turn that on, or you can hit start basically if you want to start it. But this is where you would go to set your interval timer shooting. So what that means is it's going to take multiple shots depending on what interval you have set up, and you could use that to make time-lapse photography and things like that. All right, so here's where interval timer shooting is, and then you have time-lapse video here, and same thing, you can set up how long you want to record, and you have other options as far as exposure smoothing goes. That's what full auto looks like. Now, if I switch the camera into video mode, you can see that it's automatically focusing on the eye because video mode is independent from photo mode. So if I go to the eye menu here, the options are not going to necessarily be set the same as they were in photo mode as far as the focus area goes. Because remember, if I go back to photo mode and hit the eye menu, see how I'm using wide focus? And when I have it in video mode and I hit the eye menu, it's set to the face auto area. So I'll be able to track. So if I just hit the OK button here, the tracking box comes up. I can put it over the face like so. Hit the OK button again, and now I'm tracking the face. And if I hit record, it's going to be recording video, and it's going to be tracking the face, as you can see here. So the autofocus will automatically change to keep that subject sharp as best it can, depending on the autofocus settings you have. All different settings. I'm just going to stop recording. And notice how even if it goes out of frame, it remembers. See that? Doing a pretty good job. And if you want to cancel that, notice you just hit the minus button and that will exit the tracking. And it just goes right back to autofocus auto area, which is pretty much the whole screen. Now, another thing I wanted to show you is over here on the left, you have a little icon there that says AF, and this works for both photo and video. So right now, touch AF is what's enabled. So if you touch around, it's going to drop the tracking box wherever you move. Now, if you press that again, it's going to go turn it off. Now, if you press it again, you have position focus point. It's just moving the focus point. And then if you press it again, now it's AF touch. So if you touch, it'll just automatically focus. But if I go to photography mode here, and let's see what it's set for. It's set for focus position. So see how it's not focusing? All I'm doing is moving the focus box around now, but it's not focusing. In video, it will automatically focus. So now I just have to press the shutter button halfway and it focuses. But now watch when I change that to AF touch. So now if I touch, the focus will change. You see the difference? So AF touch changes the focus, and then there's just focus position. Right? So now, and then on top of all that, there's touch shutter when you're in photography mode. So now if I touch, it's going to focus and take the shot. And that's what touch shutter is. And you can see the little icon changes depending on what mode you're in. So I'll do touch shutter over here. It's kind of hard to focus back there because it's so dark. But touch shutter is a really cool feature. I like that. And then if you press it again, it'll turn off. So that's pretty much how you use full auto mode. And you know, you're kind of limited with the options in full auto mode, but you can change your focus area. You can change a bunch of settings like I was just showing you as far as how the camera behaves and stuff. So it's pretty easy to use in that regard. So let me put the camera into program auto mode, which is the P mode here, like so. And I'll show you a couple other features. So now that it's in program auto mode, I have the ability to change the ISO. Now there's a button on the top of the camera for ISO right here. See the ISO button right there? That's the ISO button. So if you press the ISO button, you see on the bottom how the ISO lights up? So that's telling you what the ISO is. And it's currently in auto ISO. So to get off auto, what you have to do is you have to hold the button down, the ISO button, and change the dial on the front of the camera. So this dial right here, you have to turn this dial while holding the ISO button. So I got to hold the button and turn the dial like that. And that's how you can turn auto ISO off. Watch when I do it now. You can see the little auto popping up. You see the auto under the ISO there? So now I have the ISO set just to manual. So it's set to ISO 1600 and it's not going to change. But if I press the ISO button down and turn the dial, I can dial the ISO to whatever I want. When you have it set to auto, the camera will choose the ISO for you. But it is nice having the power to change it manually in this particular mode. So again, I'm going to hold the ISO button down and I'm going to turn the control wheel on the front of the camera, and now it's back into auto ISO. And because the native ISO, if I press the ISO button, I have the native ISO set to 800 and auto ISO is above 800. That's why it's flashing like that. It's just letting you know that it's higher than what you have the native ISO set to, right? So that's why it's flashing. So if it was, if I turn the native ISO up to 1000, it'll stop flashing. So you can actually do that. Even in auto ISO, you can dial the ISO into what you want, which is really cool. And that works different than any other camera I've used. The Canons don't work like that and the Sonys don't work like that, but still pretty cool. So now if I go into the I menu, you have a couple other options. As I showed you earlier, you have the auto dynamic range lighting option, you have metering. Remember how I told you about the metering modes, how it changes? So watch when I change this to highlight priority. You see how it got a lot darker because it's protecting the highlights on that figure. And if I go into spot metering, that will meter just wherever the focus is, I'm guessing, is what it's doing on this particular camera. Normally it's in the center, but I think this one is set to focus because otherwise it'd be much brighter. Notice when I do center weight average, now the image is much brighter because it's using the center of the screen to try to figure out the proper exposure. And then if I set it to matrix mode, now it's using the entire screen. So that's the different metering modes, and they're powerful tools that can help you get a proper exposure. Now remember when I told you about the exposure comp? You got that button up here, the exposure comp button. That's this button right there. So when you press that button, watch what happens. Oh, actually, let me change my metering mode back to matrix. Okay, now watch what happens when I hit the exposure comp button. You see right here how the ISO changes and that little exposure thing comes up? So what you got to do is you got to hold that button down and then you turn the command dial, and that's how you can jack up or lower the exposure compensation. Now, this is a great tool for making sure you're protecting your highlights or to just be creative with your photography. A lot of times you might want to underexpose the image a little bit, and then you can brighten it up a little bit in post, but you're also protecting those highlights. Sometimes if you expose normally, the highlights will blow out. And one way you can help determine that is by using the histogram. If you hit the display button, it'll bring up the histogram. And that little thing is showing you the bright in the image and the dark in the image. The brights are on the right and the darks are on the left. So now watch when I do my exposure compensation and watch how that histogram changes. See how it's getting, the stuff's moving to the right because it's getting brighter? And now watch when I turn this dial. See how it's moving to the left as it gets darker? So that's how the histogram works. So I like leaving the histogram up, and you can see right here that the camera is doing a really good job. It's got the shadows and the highlights. All the information looks like it's there, so we don't really need to use the exposure compensation. Sometimes though, the scene might have like a really bright object in it or whatever, and the histogram might look all jacked up, so you might have to swing it one way or another. That's what that tool is for. And pretty sweet. So, and then of course this button here is the autofocus lock and auto exposure lock button right there. So if you press that, and you can see it down here on the screen, it's auto exposure locking, which is pretty cool. So that means the exposure won't change now that I have this button pressed. That's what that button does. So you can also zoom in and out, guys. Like if you press this zoom button right here, the plus, you could zoom in. And then if you focus, you know, you could see it just more clearly. It doesn't show you the focus point, unfortunately, but you can see here clear as day that you are nailing the focus. Let me zoom back out. So you can also check that while you're, you know, perusing. So just to make sure that you focused on the right area. Like for example, if I press back here, I have that turned off. All right, so now I have focus point on. So if I press over here, and then I press the button to focus, see, it's kind of hard to tell, right? So if I zoom in, now I can see, zoom in again, it's like, yeah, no, focus is good. It's like, all right, let me zoom out, we're good to go there. Now I can take the photo, good to go. So again, this is just how you use the tools and the camera to your advantage. And like I said, program auto mode does offer quite a few more features. So for example, let me just cancel this out. If I just hit the minus button, it'll cancel that autofocus mode. And if I go into the menu, I just wanted to show you now, see how all this stuff is available? A lot of it was grayed out before. I just wanted to show you auto bracketing because this is where you would go to do HDR photography. So if you go in here and you enable auto bracket set, you can go to the right and these are all your different bracketing settings. So AE stands for auto exposure. So that's what you're going to want to use for HDR photography, but you have other options. You can do it with white balance, flash. You can also do it with the dynamic lighting option. But I want to show you how to do it with exposure. So number of shots. I like to do 3 shots and I like to do 2 EV apart. And as you can see in that little illustration there, there's like little dashes coming down. So what that's telling you is it's going to take a -2 exposure, regular exposure, which is what 0 is, and then a +2 exposure. So I'm just going to click OK. All right, so when you guys are taking bracketing shots, you're going to want to set the self timer. So you just go in here, set the self timer. So self timer is set and its number of shots is set to 3. So it's going to take the 3 photos for our auto exposure bracketing, which is pretty sweet. And like I said, this works a lot different than the Sony cameras and the Canon cameras. So you do have to have it set up this way to, you know, if you want to make sure you don't have any shake, like any camera shake. Because when you go to take a photo, you don't want to be holding your finger on the shutter the entire time. Otherwise, it's going to introduce like camera shake, you know? So you just press the button and then you don't touch the camera. It's counting down, taking all 3 shots. They're going to be tack sharp. Now when you go into the playback menu, if you scroll through the images, you can see the different brightness. Look at the histogram. See the histogram? So that's the bright exposure, that's the regular exposure, and that's the underexposure. Pretty cool how that works, right? So that's how auto exposure bracketing works. And that's great for HDR photography in particular. And again, I'm in program auto mode. Now, one other thing I do recommend though, if you're shooting HDR, I do recommend not having the ISO on auto. I would set the ISO manually. So remember, you got to hold the ISO button down and turn the command dial on the front of the camera to get off auto. And then you can dial the ISO to where you want. So for example, let's put it at ISO 100. And then I'm going to take the 3 shots again. Now the shutter speed is going to be significantly slower because it's at ISO 100, but that'll be a cleaner image with less noise. So I'm just going to go back into the menu here and turn off auto bracketing. So that's off, and then you just hit the OK button. Go into the I menu here. We can turn off self timer, put it back to single. There we go. Now it's just taking 1 shot at ISO 100. So again, that's how program auto works. And you got all these different buttons here, you know, so you can get to stuff as well. Like I said, this button up here will bring you into the release modes. You just have to hold that down and you can get to those timer options that we were just looking at from the I menu. It's just another way to do it. And you can see here it's telling you got to turn the dial, right? That's that little indicator there. So it's giving you an idea of how to operate the menu when you get to these different settings. So now let me switch it into video mode. And video mode, even though I'm in program auto, I have more power, I still can't change the ISO. So the only way that I can manually change the ISO is to put the camera into full-fledged manual mode when recording video. So just keep that in mind in case you're unaware. That's how that works. So let me just show you how to record some video. So if I hit the record button here, touch focus looks like it's off, so I need to turn that on. All right, position focus point. There we go. So I'm recording video. So now watch when I touch over here. It took a second for the focus to change, but watch. I have it on touch AF now, but it works both ways. There we go. Yeah, you don't want touch AF, it goes too fast. So what you want is position focus point. So now when I switch, see how it smoothly changes? Like it's going nice and smooth. Took a second to go back to the back there, but that's how it works. So you got to make sure that you're in this mode if you want a smooth transition. If you have it in touch AF, all it does is quickly change. You see that? And that's not going to look good if recording video. You want a nice smooth transition. You would definitely want to have it on this option here, position focus point. All right. So keep that in mind when recording video if you want those smooth transitions. In addition to that, let me just stop recording. If you go into the menu here, so under the G menu is video. So this is where the AF speed is. Now, if we slow this down, like all the way down there, for example, watch what happens when we hit record. And let me go to the back here. So once it acquires the back, it's just going to take longer for the transition. So watch when I switch to the face. It's going to take a longer time to come back to the face. So it'll be a smoother focus transition. See that? Just smoother. Slowed down the autofocus transition speed. Now that's just taking a little longer because it's having a harder time acquiring. But that's how you can manipulate the autofocus speed and get those really smooth transitions while recording video and using autofocus. So very, very powerful feature. And I wanted to make sure that you guys know about that because that's really, when you're going from like a product or something to another product, you can get these super smooth transitions. And it's hard to do manually unless you have a lot of practice. But with this tool here, you can really do a good job. And it looks great, and the camera has a lot of power. And you also have AF tracking sensitivity. So this, you can set it to low or high, and that will it'll determine how hard the camera hangs on to a focus position before it switches to another position. So I have it set to 4. I've just been leaving it there for now. But you can play with that if you want to manipulate. If you're having a hard time and it keeps switching focus, you can go and set this to low or high. High will make the focus switch quicker from one subject to another. Low will make it harder for the camera to switch from one subject to the other. It'll like hang on a little tighter with the autofocus when you have it set to low. So that's what that does. And that's very important when recording video. All right, guys, so now I'm going to switch the camera into shutter priority mode. And that's the S. You got to be in photo mode to really take advantage of shutter priority with this camera. So notice how the shutter speed, if I turn this dial in the back, is changing. Now the shutter speed is this guy right here. So if I turn that, I'm slowing the shutter down. You could see right there. So 1/13 of a second, 1/15 of a second. And the reason why the F number is blinking, that F number, by the way, is the aperture. And the aperture is the lens diaphragm, and you got to think of it like a pupil of your eye. That's what the aperture does. It changes in size just like your eye pupil. So if you change that number, it'll actually get smaller the higher the number is when it comes to aperture. Now, shutter speed is time, so you got to think of it like a clock. So 1/15 of a second is a pretty slow shutter. And if I take a photo, watch this. And if I go into playback menu, you see how that's blurry? Watch, let me hit the display button here. It's pretty cool how I enabled those options in the playback menu. Now you get all this information, which is just awesome. You might not want it though, so you can turn that stuff off. But anyways, here's a larger version. You see how that is blurry in the background? Watch, I'll spin it faster. Actually, you know what? I'm not going to spin it faster. I'm going to slow the shutter down more. So 1/15, let's go down to 1/8 of a second. So watch this. Spin that, take a photo, and let's see what that one looks like. See that? Super blurry. So that's how you get what's called motion blur, and that's why you would want to use shutter priority mode. So you can get that slow shutter if you want. So think of blurry water, streaky taillights, any kind of motion blur that you might want to capture. If you're trying to track a moving car and you want to get a blurry background, it's called panning. You would use a slower shutter speed for that when you're doing panning effects to get that blurry background. Now, shutter priority is also used to freeze the action. So if you're tracking a high-speed moving subject, like a sports athlete, for example, we're going to have to jack up that shutter to like 1/500th of a second, for example. Now, it's not going to be able to do that at ISO 100, but it looks like it's letting me, which is odd. But it's blinking, so it's telling you that it's not going to get a good exposure. So honestly, for the most part, I usually would recommend using auto ISO for shutter priority mode, but it is nice to be able to dial that in. So remember, I got to hold the ISO button down and then turn the front dial to put it on auto. And now look, the camera actually has to be at ISO 4500 to get a proper exposure. And that's how you know, because the F is not blinking anymore. That's how you know it's a proper exposure. Again, if I turn auto ISO off, you can see how it's blinking. See how it's blinking? It's basically telling you you're not going to get a proper exposure. Look what happens when I take a picture. See how it's black? It's completely underexposed because the ISO needs to be way higher. Remember, the ISO is the camera sensor sensitivity, or the gain. Think of it like when you crank a stereo up but there's no music playing. You know how you could hear that hiss, like that shh? That's gain, that's noise, digital noise. So now again, let me put it back on auto ISO and notice how the ISO went to 4000. So if I take the shot now, it'll be a proper exposure. And everything's frozen, but nothing's spinning, so you can't really tell. But watch. So say this is like an athlete running or something, right? Now watch this. If I hit the playback button, you see how it's frozen? That's because the shutter speed was so fast, it was able to freeze the action. And again, that's what shutter priority mode is for. I'm a big fan of shutter priority. I use it all the time, and it's a great feature. Now, let's switch to aperture priority mode. That's the A mode here. And let me show you what that's all about. So now you can see, instead of the shutter having a box around it, the aperture has a box around it. Whoops, I just touched the screen and enabled the tracking icon there. So I'm just going to hit the minus button here to exit that. All right, so now we're back to using the whole area. See how the aperture is at f3.8? Now if I turn the dial, it's actually going to be the command dial on the front of the camera. You see how the F number is changing? That's what aperture does. And that's changing the size of the lens diaphragm. So right there, if I focus, I want to show you what the other aspect of aperture is, which is depth of field. So if I focus over here, you could see in the center area how the background is blurry. You could also see how this figure is blurry, like the face, right? It's a little blurry. Let's see how close I can get this. All right, right about there. You see how blurry the face is? It's pretty cool, right? Now watch when I select over here and I focus on the face. Now you see how the chart is blurry? That's called depth of field. Now depth of field is basically how thick of a sliver from the area that you focus. So I'm focused on this face right here. So the depth of field will go to like a couple inches in front of this figure and a couple inches behind. And that's the depth of field like plane. So the lower the F number, the shallower the depth of field. For example, if I raise the depth of field by changing the aperture to a higher number, let's put it at like f11. Let's go all the way to f16 actually. So now you can see the face is sharp, behind the face is sharp, like the fan that I have there, and this chart is sharper. Now this chart is still a little bit blurry because it's so close to the camera, but if I put it like right about here, you could see now the depth of field is much larger. So again, watch when I lower it, it's at f16. Watch when I put it back to f3.8. You see how that chart got extra blurry? Let me focus on the chart and watch this. See how the face is blurry? Now watch when I stop it down to like f16 or whatever. You'll see the face get sharper and sharper and sharper. So there you have it. So that's the largest depth of field you can get. But again, at this range, it's still pretty narrow. If I go to f16, you can see pretty much everything is sharp in the scene. And if I lower it down to f3.5, it'll still look like everything is pretty sharp. And that's just because the distance from the camera. And so for portraits, you would most likely want the aperture at a lower number so the background is blurrier. For example, let's set this face up and pretend that we're taking a portrait. So there's my little figure. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in, try to get a nice portrait shot here, something like that. Focus, and you can see the background is super buttery blurry, like so. So f6.3 is the fastest aperture I can have at 50 millimeter. All right, so now if I go into the playback menu and I zoom in, it should be nice and sharp on the face. Yeah, but you can see the subject is sharp, and look at the background. You see how blurry it is? You can't make out anything. It just completely buttered out the background. So now if I stop it down, let's put it at like f16 or f22 or something. Now the background's still blurry, but you can see more detail. It's not as blurry. So you see the difference? That's f16. Whoops. So that's f16 versus 6.3. See that? Big difference. All right, guys, so again, I'm still in aperture priority mode, but one other feature I wanted to show you is the minimum shutter option. So right now, I can't control the shutter speed. The camera's choosing that, and I have it set to auto ISO. So right now, it's set to 1/30th of a second. So if I'm taking a portrait, for example, I might not want it at 1/30th of a second because my kids are moving around, right? I need a faster shutter speed than that. Otherwise, you know, if my kid's moving, you know what I mean? Like, come on, stay still, but they just keep moving. You're going to need a faster shutter to freeze that action. But I'm in aperture priority mode, so I can't do that. Well, you can do that. If you go into the menu here, and you go into ISO sensitivity settings, check this out, guys. This is amazing. Right here, if you go to minimum shutter speed, check this out. You can actually set your shutter speed to any shutter speed that you want, or in auto, which is what I like to do, if you go over to the right, you can make it faster. So let's put it up to faster, select OK, and now look. See my minimum shutter speed? Now it's at 1/125th of a second. So this is awesome if you're taking pictures of kids and stuff where they're just moving a little bit. Like 1/60th of a second should be fast enough for most things, but like I said, kids move quick. So again, if you're subject to staying fairly still, but just a little bit of movement, you can raise this minimum shutter speed up to fast, which will give you about 1/125th of a second. So if you're somebody with shaky hands and you just can't get sharp shots, for example, you might want to raise this up as well. So depending on your purposes. If you have really steady hands, then you could use this at a lower speed. But it's just a great feature, and I highly recommend checking it out if you need it. Now again, you could put it at just one step faster, and that should put it at about 1/60th of a second. Yeah, 1/60th, see? So that's a good place to go if you don't have an image stabilized lens, for example. So 1/60th is pretty good for hand holding, I would say. But if you need a faster speed, you can go in there and change that right in the ISO sensitivity settings. As you can see here, I'm just going to put it back to default. And same goes, you could lower that as well if you want. If you want a slower shutter because you're using a tripod, for example, and you want to capture some motion blur or whatever while in aperture priority mode, you can slow it down there, or you can dial it in by selecting the actual shutter speed. You know, you can just go in here and select whatever shutter speed you want. All right, guys, it is time to go into manual mode here. So let's switch it to manual mode, and let me show you how the camera works in manual mode. Now again, in aperture priority, I didn't cover it, but in video, it's pretty much the same exact thing as it was in program auto. You can just dial in the aperture if you want, but you can't change the ISO, and it's pretty much pretty auto based. So you really, if you're recording video and you want to get creative, you want to put it in manual mode. Now in manual mode, you could see how on the bottom here, all the boxes. So I got 3 boxes, meaning I can either click it with my finger and change it, or you could use the dials. So the front command dial is controlling the aperture. See the F number changing? So that's the aperture. The back dial is the shutter speed. And the ISO I have set to auto, so that's automatically changing. Now, of course, we can hard set that so it doesn't change by taking it off auto, like so. And now it's giving us a live preview because we're in manual mode. So you can see here, it's giving us a representation of what the exposure looks like. It's way underexposed, right? Obviously, it's like the screen's black. So we need to either raise the ISO or we could lower the shutter speed, because remember, shutter speed is time. So if we allow more time for the light to come in, the exposure will get brighter. All right, so watch when I continue to lower the shutter speed, how the exposure is going back to where you would want it. As you can see at the histogram, right? Because you want that to be balanced. So you're gonna want it like right around there. That looks like a pretty good exposure. So you're pretty good. There we go. Now the shutter speed is at 1/10 of a second. That might be too slow if you want to freeze the action. So let's watch. Yeah, see? So now if you want to use manual mode and you want to freeze the action, remember we're going to have to put that shutter back up to a faster speed, which is going to then lower the exposure. So I could probably get away with, let's put it at 1/400th of a second. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to raise the ISO up. That's the only other way to raise the exposure because I can't lower that F number anymore. If I had a faster lens, I'd be able to lower that F number, which would help brighten the image. But in this case, the only way to do it is to use ISO. So let's just raise up the ISO and look how the exposure is coming back. See? So somewhere right around 3200 is looking pretty good. And now we have that 1/400th of a shutter speed, and we have the ISO at 3200. So if I spin this again, we should be able to freeze the action a little better. Let's see what we got this time. Let me hit play, and there you have it. So now we froze the action using manual mode. And remember, you can use the aperture if you want to change that to manipulate the depth of field like I showed you earlier. So manual mode gives you just full power. So let me switch it into video mode. And now notice in video mode, again, you have full power as well, which is really nice. So this is the only mode where you can take the auto ISO off when recording video. So if I go to the ISO and turn that front command, again, now we're back in full manual mode. So we're going to need to lower that shutter speed because we're recording video, so we're not going to want that shutter speed anyway. Optimally, you want the shutter to be twice what you're recording at. So I'm recording at 4K at 24 frames per second. So the closest shutter speed that's double that would be 1/50th of a second. So if you're recording at 60 frames per second, for example, you would want double that. Same thing if you're recording slow motion at 120p, you would want to double that. So that would be 1/250th of a second, for example. So right around here would be good for video, except the exposure is not looking very good. So let me hit the display button to bring up that histogram to get a better view, like so. And now I can dial in the ISO to raise it up to get a proper exposure. So we're looking at somewhere right about there. So ISO 400 is looking pretty good for this particular scene, and that's me controlling everything independent. So let's say that I want a larger depth of field. So I'm going to raise that aperture up. I want to get a larger depth of field, and so this way the stuff in the background will be sharper and in the foreground will be a little bit sharper. But notice how it got darker. So the only thing I can do is raise the ISO, or I could slow down the shutter speed, but I'm recording video. I don't want to do that. I want the shutter speed to be locked at that. So let me raise the ISO up, and I'm going to have to go up a couple of stops to compensate for that aperture change. So looking at the histogram, I'd say somewhere right about there. So that's using manual mode. Now I want to show you a couple other options in the menu here. All right, so we're in video mode here. Let's go down to the video camera. So if we go here to frame rate, I just wanted to show you this. So right here you have 120, and if you scroll down, you have these options as well. So you got 120, 24p slow motion. This will actually record in slow motion inside the camera at 24p, so it'll export it like that. If you want 120 and you want it to record at 120, you would want to use this option here, and then you'd be able to slow the footage down in post-processing if you want. But if you want the video footage to be captured in slow motion, you want to choose the option down here. That's what these are for. So I just wanted you to make you aware of that. This will record it, and it'll actually be in slow motion on the memory card. So I actually tend to use this option more because I like to have audio and I like to slow it down in post myself. So this way I can speed it up and slow it down pretty easy. That technique is known as speed ramping, and that's how I like to do it. Now, one other thing I need to show you guys is when you put the camera into selfie mode. So if I swing this out, the screen out, and turn the camera around, the camera is now in selfie mode. And notice here on the screen how you can't see anything. The histogram's gone, and if you hit the display button on the back, I'm hitting the display button with my finger and nothing is changing on the screen. So I don't know what the exposure looks like, and I don't like that. So now if you bend the screen back a little bit and it comes out of selfie mode, like that, you see how the histogram just came back? Because it's out of selfie mode. It's like there's a threshold, right when you get to there, it switches to selfie and the screen changes. So I just wanted to make you aware that you can change the exposure and stuff like that, so you can manipulate it, but it's hard to see what's going on without the histogram, especially if you're outside in the bright sun. That it's hard to tell the proper brightness when you're outside. So you really need that histogram. So in the menu system, let me just swing this around here and hit menu. So in the menu, if you go here to setup and you scroll down here, see this self-portrait mode? turn that off. And then when you swing the camera out like so, you still have the histogram. You see how the histogram is there? So if you're doing vlogging and you need that histogram to make sure your exposure is correct, that's where you would go about doing that. And I have it off on mine. I prefer to have it off. I just put it back into auto mode there. And then, like I showed you earlier, you have your user settings on the mode. You got U1, U2, and U3, and that's what it stands for. So you can just configure the camera however you want, and then you can go into the menu and save those settings. Right here, save user settings. So that's where you would go to program your user 1, user 2, and user 3, and it's right in the wrench icon. And that's pretty much it. I showed you pretty much everything. And then the record lamp brightness, I showed you that as well earlier. That's great for when you're recording selfie footage so you know the camera's recording. So, all right guys, that about wraps up this video. So if you guys got something out of this video, I would really appreciate it if you give me a thumbs up and maybe consider hitting that subscribe button if you want to see more content like this in the future. So thanks again, and I will catch up with you next time. Take care.